Hitler and Stalin, Tyrants and the Second World War. Hitler, like Stalin, came from the periphery. Stalin was born in December 1878 in Georgia. 2000 came from the capital of the Russian Empire, St. Petersburg. If not literally, then metaphorically, Hitler came from an area even further removed from the center of German political life. He was born in April 1889 not in Imperial Germany, but in neighboring Austria, in the border town of Braunau am Main. They both came from simple families. Hitler's father was a customs inspector. Stalin's father, a shoemaker, was much poorer. Both parents were drunkards and often had the historical truth publishes an excerpt from this book with the kind permission of the publishing house. All this is true, but in the long run it can lead to wrong conclusions. Therefore, it should be remembered that a huge number of other people were brought up in the same conditions, but as a result they did not terrorize millions of citizens. It is worth resisting the temptation to believe that individuals as prone to dominance as Hitler and Stalin were destined to achieve immeasurable power. Not at all. Hitler and Stalin expectedly gained recognition only as a result of an epoch-making and destructive event over which they had no power, the First World War. In July 1914, on the eve of the war, no one could have predicted that the then 25-year-old Hitler would become one of the most infamous leaders in world history. At that time, he did not even dream of a career as a politician, but tried to make a living as an artist, moving from Vienna to Munich. He was considered an eccentric who liked to talk about art and literature in front of others and to blame the world for his failures. There was no end to things, even little things, that could upset him, recalled Hitler's pre-war roommate in Vienna. In general, in those early days in Vienna, I got the impression that Adolf was somewhat imbalanced. He was irritated by the slightest trifle. If you happened to meet this pre-war Hitler, you would most likely agree with the later assessment of one of his trench comrades that there was something special about him. Stalin, unlike Hitler, was already a revolutionary in 1914. 15 years earlier, he had left the seminary, where he was preparing to become a priest, and as a devoted Marxist took up the cause of overthrowing the state system. When the guns of the First World War roared, Stalin was in exile in Siberia, having a criminal past in particular. He was actively involved in the organization of an armed robbery in Tiflis and Tbilisi, Georgia in 1907. Despite his fervent belief in the revolution and his rejection of the name Josip Jugoslavely, which he changed to the high-profile pseudonym Stalin, his revolutionary group seemed to have little chance of coming to power. The First World War changed the fate of both of these men. After bred riots in Russia and failed military campaigns at the front, Tsar Nicholas was forced to abdicate in March 1917. But this did not mean that the Bolsheviks, to whom Stalin belonged, were bound to come to power. The onset of this fateful event was accelerated by the disastrous decisions of the provisional government, adopted after the removal of the Tsar, and the collapse of political and economic institutions. In the summer of 1917, the provisional government ordered the Russian army to launch an offensive operation. This is exactly what the Bolsheviks, under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, took advantage of. During the battle for Galicia with the Austro-Hungarian forces, riots broke out in the army as Bolshevik revolutionaries serving in each military unit turned the soldiers against their commanders. Within a few months, after the October Revolution, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were in power. If it is difficult to imagine how all this could have happened if it were not for the events of the First World War, then it is impossible to imagine how Hitler became the leader of a political party, and not to mention the position of Chancellor of Germany if it were not for the circumstances of the defeat of Germany in November 1918. His disgust and fury at defeat in the war, as well as the desire to find scapegoats, Hitler was able to quickly enter politics. In September 1919, he joined a small extremist group in Munich called the German Workers' Party. Within 2 years, he became its leader, and the party itself was renamed the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, which was later briefly called the Nazi Party. In the 1920s, Hitler and Stalin were already markedly different from each other in terms of how they saw their respective roles in their political world. Unlike Stalin, Hitler was a typical charismatic leader. This concept was once defined by the German sociologist Max Weber. Charismatic leaders rely primarily on the strength of their personality to justify their position. They do not fit well into bureaucratic structures and emit an almost missionary aura. It all came from the heart, and he touched the strings in each of us, recalled Hans Frank. Heard Hitler's speech in 1920 and became one of the leaders of the Nazi Party. He said what was on the mind of everyone present and connected the general Escrim with a clear understanding and shared desires of the afflicted who longed to have some program. But that's not all. He showed us the way, the only way for peoples who had not been spared by history. The way of a strict new ascent from the deepest of his thanks to courage, faith, readiness for action, hard work and devotion to a great shining goal. Frank's assertion that Hitler spoke what was on everyone's mind draws attention to an important aspect for understanding his appeal. Charismatic leaders like Hitler can only be influential when an audience is willing to accept their ideas. If you radically disagreed with Hitler in the 1920s, you could almost certainly resist his charisma. For example, Hitler's speeches did not convince a person like Herbert Richter, a German veteran of the First World War. Richter, who was not inclined to support Hitler, believed that he had a raspy voice and usually shouted. Stalin, on the other hand, was the opposite of Weber's model of a charismatic leader, not only because he was a bad speaker, but also because instead of shunning bureaucracy, he readily embraced it. Throughout his political life, Stalin knew very well the power of party committee meetings. In this aspect, he was very lucky, as his character exactly met the requirements of the new structures of the Soviet state. Stalin managed a huge number of people who worked in administrative positions of the Soviet system, with their number increased from 4 million in 1929 to almost 14 million in 1939. This dichotomy between the charismatic orator Hitler and the member of numerous committees Stalin is decisive. It was a red thread running through the whole history. For example, this difference affected the different attitudes of the two leaders towards the role of the political parties for which they were responsible. Although Stalin eventually allowed the NUCT and some economic commissariats to compete with the party for influence, it is inconceivable that he ever tried to destroy the Communist Party completely. He always remained, at least in theory, its loyal servant. Hitler, on the contrary, was always suspicious of any institutional attempts to limit himself. He did everything he could to thwart any centralized attempt to usurp his power. That is why he allowed the German cabinet to atrophy over time, because after 1938 the cabinet was not convened again. Perhaps he even believed that it was possible to get rid of the Nazi Party, which he once helped to create. Hans Frank recalls that once at a dinner party in 1938, Hitler said he would be the first to throw down a flaming torch and destroy to the core the Nazi Party if he deemed it no longer needed. Membership in the Nazi Party was less exclusive than membership in the Soviet Communist Party. In 1939, about 5 million people had a party ticket of the Nazi Party, while there were less than 2 million Bolshevik Party members, despite the fact that there were more than twice as many Soviet citizens as German citizens. Stalin considered the party an elitist institution, and while Hitler continued to value the Nazi Party he helped create, he was never as devoted to it. In governing Germany, Hitler relied on Gauleiter party leaders on the ground. Almost 40 Gauleiter owed their power to Hitler. He could meet with each of them in turn to make sure they were committed to his plans. They themselves had such a powerful autonomy under Hitler that they could even ignore the instructions of the sinister head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler. Sometimes they even went so far as to make fun of him. Albert Forster, the Gauleiter of Danzig, West Prussia, whom Himmler hated, once remarked, "If I looked like Himmler, I wouldn't talk about the idea of race." It is impossible to imagine that in the Soviet system, one of Stalin's subordinates would openly mock the local Himmler Leventry Beria, head of the NUCT. One of the simple ideas of the two ideologies preached by Hitler and Stalin was a wavering opposition to the values of liberal democracy. Both of them resolutely rejected the principles underlying freedom in its modern sense. Both condemned freedom of speech. Both violated human rights at all levels. Crucially, both ideologies destroyed man's ability to be an individual. You did not have the right to choose your identity. Either you adapted to the new value system or you were persecuted. So in the end, this was the reason why the utopias of Hitler and Stalin were impossible without tyranny. Even if it were possible to reach the promised land, those who had the audacity to say that they did not like this new paradise would be punished in the same way. I hope that this book will clearly demonstrate that neither system was possible without oppression. It was the system itself.